Hey everyone, tonight we're going to dive into what dating was like in medieval times. Let's not wait any longer and get this story started. When we think about romance in medieval times, we might imagine knights wooing fair maidens with poetry and grand gestures. But the reality of courtship and what we might call dating in the medieval period was far more complex and fascinating than these romanticized images suggest. The very concept of dating as we understand it today simply did not exist in the same form during the medieval era, which roughly spanned from the 5th to the 15th centuries. And instead, the process of finding a romantic partner was deeply intertwined with social class, family expectations, economic considerations, and religious doctrine in ways that would seem quite foreign to modern sensibilities. In the early medieval period, particularly among the nobility and upper classes, marriages were primarily political and economic arrangements orchestrated by families rather than romantic partnerships chosen by the individuals involved. Young people, especially women, had little say in whom they would marry, and the concept of falling in love before marriage was not only uncommon, but often viewed with suspicion or even disapproval by parents and society at large. The idea that two people might meet, get to know each other gradually, and choose to spend their lives together based on mutual affection and compatibility was largely relegated to the realm of literature and fantasy rather than lived reality. However, this does not mean that romance and courtship were entirely absent from medieval life. Rather, they took forms that were heavily regulated by social customs, religious teachings, and practical considerations that shaped every aspect of medieval existence. The process of courtship, when it did occur, was a carefully choreographed dance of propriety and protocol that involved not just the potential couple but their entire families and social networks, creating a web of relationships and obligations that extended far beyond the simple attraction between two individuals. For the common people, peasants, and those in the emerging merchant classes, the situation was somewhat different but no less complex. While arranged marriages were still common, practical considerations often allowed for more personal choice, particularly when it came to second marriages or unions between individuals of similar social standing. A young peasant woman might have some input into her choice of husband, especially if her family needed her labor and could not afford to lose her to an unsuitable match. But even then, economic factors and family needs typically took precedence over romantic inclinations. The medieval period saw the gradual development of what historians call courtly love, a literary and cultural phenomenon that began in the courts of southern France in the 11th and 12th centuries and spread throughout Europe over the following centuries. This concept, which was immortalized in the poetry of troubadours and the romances of writers like Chrétien de Troyes, presented an idealized vision of romantic love that was both passionate and spiritual, often involving a knight's devotion to a noble lady who was typically married to someone else. This tradition of courtly love was largely literary and aspirational rather than practical, but it did begin to influence how people thought about romance and relationships, even if it had little impact on actual marriage practices. The rise of courtly love literature created a cultural space where the idea of romantic attraction and emotional connection between men and women could be explored and celebrated, even if such connections were rarely the basis for actual marriages. The troubadours sang of love that was ennobling and transformative, love that could inspire great deeds and moral improvement, love that was worth suffering for and even dying for. This literary tradition gradually began to influence court culture and the behavior of the nobility, creating expectations and ideals about romance that would eventually filter down through society and begin to shape actual courtship practices. In practical terms, courtship in medieval times, when it occurred at all, was a highly supervised and regulated process that took place within strict social boundaries. Young people of marriageable age were rarely left alone together, and any interaction between potential romantic partners typically occurred in the presence of family members, servants, or other chaperones who could ensure that proper decorum was maintained. The concept of privacy, as we understand it today, was largely absent from medieval life, and romantic relationships developed within the context of community oversight and social expectations. The physical aspects of courtship were similarly constrained by social and religious norms that emphasized modesty and restraint. Medieval Christianity taught that sexual desire was inherently sinful and potentially dangerous, something to be controlled and channeled appropriately within the bonds of marriage. This created a complex relationship between romantic attraction and physical expression, where couples who were genuinely attracted to each other had to navigate their feelings within a framework that discouraged open displays of affection and physical intimacy outside of marriage. Religious doctrine played a crucial role in shaping medieval attitudes toward courtship and marriage, with the Catholic Church gradually asserting more control over marriage practices throughout the medieval period. The Church taught that marriage was a sacrament ordained by God, a permanent and indissoluble union that should be entered into primarily for the purposes of procreation and mutual support rather than for romantic fulfillment. This religious framework created both opportunities and constraints for young people seeking romantic connections, as it provided a sacred context for marriage while also restricting the ways in which courtship could unfold. The role of families in medieval courtship cannot be overstated, as parents and extended family members were typically the primary decision makers when it came to marriage arrangements. A young person's romantic preferences were generally considered far less important than the potential benefits or drawbacks that a marriage might bring to the family as a whole. This could include economic advantages, political alliances, social advancement, or simply the practical benefits of combining households and resources. Families would often begin considering potential matches for their children from a very early age, and negotiations between families might continue for months or even years before a marriage was finally arranged. For women in particular, the medieval period presented unique challenges and constraints when it came to courtship and marriage. Women were generally considered to be under the legal and social authority of their fathers until marriage, at which point that authority transferred to their husbands. This system, known as coverture, meant that women had very limited legal rights and little control over their own romantic destinies. A woman's value in the marriage market was largely determined by her dowry, her family's social standing, her reputation for virtue and piety, and her physical appearance, rather than by her personal preferences or individual qualities. Despite these constraints, medieval women did find ways to exercise some agency in their romantic lives, particularly those who possessed significant wealth or social status. Noble women might use their influence at court to encourage or discourage certain matches, and women who became widows often gained more freedom to choose their own romantic partners, since they were no longer under the direct authority of fathers or husbands. The literature of courtly love also gave women a central role as the objects of devotion and the arbiters of romantic worthiness, creating a cultural space where female agency in romantic matters could be celebrated and explored. The practical aspects of medieval courtship varied significantly depending on social class, geographic location, and historical period, but certain common patterns emerged across different communities and cultures. Gift-giving was an important part of courtship rituals, with suitors presenting tokens of their affection and serious intentions to the objects of their interest. These gifts might include jewelry, clothing, books, religious objects, or other items that demonstrated both the suitor's wealth and his understanding of the recipient's tastes and interests. The exchange of gifts also served as a form of public declaration, signaling to the community that a courtship was underway, and that the individuals involved should be considered as a potential couple. Poetry and music played significant roles in medieval courtship, particularly among the educated classes who had access to literary culture and artistic traditions. The ability to compose or recite verse was considered an important social skill, and many courtships involved the exchange of poems, songs, and other artistic expressions of romantic feeling. The troubadour tradition in particular celebrated the power of music and poetry to express and inspire love, and many nobles learned to play musical instruments and compose verses as part of their education and social development. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life also influenced courtship practices, with certain times of year being more conducive to romantic activities than others. Spring and summer, with their associations with fertility and renewal, were popular times for courtship and marriage ceremonies, while winter months were often devoted to indoor activities that might bring young people together in more intimate settings. Religious festivals and holidays provided opportunities for social gathering and celebration that could facilitate romantic connections, though always within the bounds of appropriate behavior and community supervision. Medieval dating, such as it was, also had to contend with the practical realities of medieval life, including limited mobility, poor communication systems, and the constant threats of war, disease, and economic hardship. Young people who lived in rural areas might have very few opportunities to meet potential partners outside of their immediate communities, while those in larger towns and cities had more opportunities for social interaction, but also faced greater scrutiny from neighbors and authorities. The process of getting to know someone romantically might unfold over years rather than months, with couples seeing each other only occasionally and always in supervised settings. The concept of romantic compatibility, while not entirely absent from medieval thinking, was generally considered less important than practical compatibility in terms of social status, economic resources, and family background. A successful medieval marriage was one that produced children, maintained or improved the family's social and economic position, and fulfilled the social and religious obligations expected of married couples. Whether the spouses actually liked each other or felt romantic attraction was often considered a secondary concern, though it was generally acknowledged that mutual affection made marriage more pleasant and sustainable. Economic considerations permeated every aspect of medieval courtship and marriage, from the initial identification of potential partners to the final marriage negotiations. The dowry system meant that a woman's family had to provide money, property, or goods to her husband's family as part of the marriage agreement, while the husband's family was expected to provide financial security and social protection for the wife. These economic exchanges were often the primary focus of marriage negotiations, with romantic considerations taking a back seat to financial arrangements and property transfers. The legal framework surrounding marriage in medieval times was complex and varied from region to region, but generally emphasized the importance of consent from both parties and their families, the exchange of vows in the presence of witnesses, and the consummation of the marriage through sexual intercourse. The Catholic Church gradually developed more elaborate requirements for valid marriages, including the posting of bans to allow community members to raise objections, the presence of a priest during the ceremony, and the registration of marriages in church records. These legal requirements created a formal structure for marriage that helped regulate courtship practices and ensure that romantic relationships developed within appropriate boundaries. The role of intermediaries in medieval courtship was also significant, with matchmakers, family friends, and other go-betweens often facilitating introductions and negotiations between potential partners and their families. These intermediaries might be professional matchmakers who made their living arranging marriages, or they might be friends, relatives, or community leaders who took on the role of bringing compatible people together. The use of intermediaries allowed families to explore potential matches without committing themselves publicly, and helped ensure that courtship proceeded according to appropriate social protocols. Medieval literature provides fascinating insights into the ideals and fantasies surrounding romantic love during this period, even if these literary representations were often quite different from lived reality. The Arthurian romances, with their tales of knights and ladies engaging in elaborate courtships filled with tests of worthiness and declarations of undying devotion, created powerful cultural narratives about what romantic love could and should look like. Similarly, the works of medieval poets like Dante, whose idealized love for Beatrice inspired some of the greatest poetry in Western literature, demonstrated the transformative power that romantic feeling could have on individual consciousness and artistic creation. The development of chivalric ideals during the later medieval period also influenced courtship practices, at least among the nobility and those who aspired to noble status. The code of chivalry emphasized the importance of protecting and honoring women, and it created expectations about how knights and gentlemen should behave toward the objects of their romantic interest. This included demonstrating courage and honor in military endeavors, showing courtesy and respect in social interactions, and maintaining absolute devotion and fidelity to one's chosen lady. While these chivalric ideals were often honored more in literature than in practice, they did create cultural standards that influenced actual behavior and expectations. The medieval period also saw the gradual emergence of what we might recognize as more modern forms of romantic expression, particularly in urban areas where increased literacy, greater social mobility, and more diverse cultural influences created new possibilities for courtship and relationship formation. Merchants and craftspeople, who often had more economic independence than peasants and more social flexibility than nobles, began to develop courtship practices that emphasized personal choice and romantic compatibility to a greater degree than had been traditional in earlier periods. The influence of classical literature and philosophy on medieval thinking about love and relationships was also significant, particularly among educated elites who had access to works by authors like Ovid, whose Art of Love provided detailed instructions on seduction and romantic strategy. These classical influences were filtered through Christian moral frameworks, creating complex and sometimes contradictory attitudes toward romantic desire and sexual expression that shaped courtship practices throughout the medieval period. The practical logistics of medieval courtship were often quite challenging, given the limited transportation and communication technologies available during this period. A young man who wished to court a woman who lived in another town or region might need to undertake dangerous and expensive journeys simply to visit her, and maintaining a romantic relationship over distance required considerable dedication and resources. Letters were an important means of romantic communication for those who could read and write, but literacy rates were low throughout much of the medieval period, and the delivery of messages was often unreliable and slow. The seasonal nature of medieval agriculture and the rhythm of religious festivals also created natural cycles of social interaction that influenced when and how courtship could take place. Harvest festivals, religious celebrations, and seasonal fairs provided opportunities for young people from different communities to meet and interact, while the long winter months offered more intimate settings for developing relationships within local communities. The church calendar, with its cycle of feast days and fasting periods, also shaped the timing of courtship and marriage activities, as certain times of year were considered more or less appropriate for romantic pursuits. The role of physical appearance and personal attractiveness in medieval courtship was complex and multifaceted, influenced by both practical considerations and cultural ideals that were often quite different from modern standards of beauty. Medieval people valued clear skin, good teeth, and overall health as indicators of both physical attractiveness and moral virtue, while cultural ideals of beauty often emphasized pale skin, blonde hair, and delicate features among women, and strength, height, and martial prowess among men. However, these aesthetic preferences were always balanced against more practical considerations like family background, economic resources, and reproductive potential. Personal hygiene and grooming practices were important aspects of medieval courtship, though the standards and methods available were quite different from those we know today. Regular bathing was not common among most medieval people, but special attention to cleanliness and appearance was expected during courtship and social interactions. Perfumes, cosmetics, and elaborate clothing were used by those who could afford them to enhance their attractiveness and demonstrate their social status, while simpler forms of personal care and grooming were practiced by people of all social levels. The medieval understanding of human sexuality and its role in romantic relationships was heavily influenced by religious doctrine and medical theory that would seem quite strange to modern minds. Medieval physicians and theologians believed that sexual desire was potentially dangerous and needed to be carefully controlled, but they also recognized that sexual compatibility was important for successful marriages and the production of children. This created complex attitudes toward physical attraction and sexual expression that influenced how courtship unfolded and what expectations couples had about their romantic and physical relationships. The transition from courtship to engagement and marriage in medieval times involved elaborate rituals and ceremonies that served to publicize the union and ensure community support for the new couple. Betrothal ceremonies might take place months or even years before the actual wedding, creating a formal period of engagement during which the couple could get to know each other better while remaining under family supervision. These engagement periods also allowed families to make final arrangements regarding dowries, property transfers, and other practical matters that needed to be settled before the marriage could take place. Medieval wedding ceremonies themselves were often elaborate affairs that involved the entire community and served multiple social functions beyond simply uniting two individuals in marriage. The wedding feast, in particular, was an important opportunity for families to demonstrate their wealth and social status, while also providing entertainment and celebration for friends and neighbors. The specific customs and traditions surrounding medieval weddings varied greatly from region to region and evolved significantly over time, but they generally emphasized the public and communal nature of marriage as a social institution, rather than simply a private romantic commitment. The role of the church in regulating medieval marriage and courtship practices became increasingly important throughout the medieval period, as religious authorities sought to establish clearer standards for valid marriages and to prevent practices like divorce, polygamy, and informal unions that were seen as threatening to social stability and religious order. The development of canon law regarding marriage created more formal requirements for courtship and wedding ceremonies, while also providing some protections for individuals who might otherwise be forced into unwanted marriages. The economic aspects of medieval marriage extended far beyond simple dowry arrangements to encompass complex systems of property ownership, inheritance rights, and financial obligation that shaped every aspect of married life. A successful courtship often involved detailed negotiations between families regarding these economic arrangements, and young people who were contemplating marriage had to consider not only their personal feelings, but also the long-term financial implications of their choice of partner. The concept of marrying for love was often seen as a luxury that only the very wealthy could afford, while most people had to balance romantic inclinations against practical economic necessities. Medieval society's attitude toward remarriage and second marriages was generally more accepting than its attitude toward divorce, particularly for widows and widowers who needed to find new partners for practical and economic reasons. Widows who inherited property or businesses from their deceased husbands often found themselves in the unusual position of having significant control over their own romantic destinies, and many chose to remarry for companionship, security, or love, rather than simply accepting the first proposal they received. This created opportunities for more egalitarian and romantically oriented relationships than were typical in first marriages arranged by families. The development of urban centers during the later medieval period created new contexts for courtship and romantic relationships that were quite different from the rural settings where most medieval people lived. Cities and towns offered greater anonymity, more diverse populations, and increased opportunities for social and economic mobility, all of which influenced how romantic relationships developed and evolved. Young people who moved to cities for work or education often found themselves with more freedom to choose their own romantic partners, though they also faced new challenges in terms of establishing their reputations and finding suitable matches without the support of traditional family and community networks. The medieval period also saw the gradual emergence of what we might recognize as romantic subcultures, particularly among certain groups like university students, court attendants, and members of religious orders who lived in communities that were somewhat separated from traditional family structures. These communities often developed their own customs and traditions regarding romantic relationships, which might be more or less restrictive than those of mainstream society, depending on the specific context and the attitudes of the authorities who govern these communities. The influence of Islamic and Eastern traditions on medieval European courtship practices was also significant, particularly in regions like Spain and southern Italy, where different cultural traditions came into contact with each other. Islamic poetry and philosophy included sophisticated discussions of romantic love and courtship practices that influenced European writers and thinkers, while trade relationships and cultural exchange introduced new ideas about romantic relationships and marriage customs that gradually spread throughout Europe. The role of clothing and fashion in medieval courtship was both practical and symbolic, as the way people dressed communicated important information about their social status, economic resources, and personal taste that potential romantic partners and their families would use to evaluate their suitability as marriage prospects. Sumptuary laws in many medieval societies regulated who could wear certain types of clothing and ornaments, making fashion choices particularly significant as indicators of social position and economic capability. Medieval medical knowledge about human reproduction and sexuality also influenced courtship practices and marriage customs. Though much of this knowledge was based on classical sources and religious teachings rather than empirical observation. Medieval people believed that compatibility between potential partners could be determined through various means, including astrological calculation, physical examination, and assessment of temperamental characteristics. And these beliefs influenced how matches were made and how successful marriages were predicted. The medieval understanding of love itself was complex and multifaceted, drawing on classical philosophy, Christian theology, and practical social experience to create various categories and types of romantic feeling that were recognized and discussed in literature and everyday life. The distinction between carnal love and spiritual love, for example, was considered crucial for understanding how romantic relationships should develop and what their ultimate purposes should be. While the concept of courtly love created idealized standards for romantic behavior that influenced real courtship practices, even when they could not be fully realized in practice. The role of servants, attendants, and other household members in facilitating or hindering medieval courtship was also significant, as these individuals often served as intermediaries, messengers, and confidants for young people who were seeking romantic relationships. The famous literary trope of the clever servant who helps young lovers overcome obstacles placed in their path by disapproving parents reflects the reality that household staff often played crucial roles in the development and maintenance of romantic relationships, though their motivations for doing so might be quite complex and not always aligned with the interests of their employers. Medieval attitudes toward age differences in romantic relationships were generally more accepting of significant disparities between partners than would be considered appropriate today, particularly when older men married much younger women. These age differences were often the result of practical considerations like inheritance patterns, economic necessity, and the desire to ensure that wives would be young enough to bear multiple children. But they also reflected cultural assumptions about gender roles and the relative maturity and decision-making capacity of men and women. The development of more sophisticated literary and artistic traditions during the later medieval period created new vocabularies and frameworks for understanding and expressing romantic feelings that influenced how people thought about their own relationships and romantic experiences. The rise of vernacular literature, in particular, made romantic themes and courtly love ideals accessible to broader audiences who might not have been able to read Latin texts, spreading new ideas about love and courtship throughout medieval society. The medieval period's approach to what we might call long-distance relationships was necessarily quite different from our modern experience, given the limitations of transportation and communication technology. Couples who were separated by distance had to rely on letters, messages delivered by travelers, and occasional visits to maintain their romantic connections. And many relationships that began with mutual attraction had to be sustained over years of separation due to various practical and social constraints. The role of dreams, visions, and supernatural experiences in medieval courtship and romantic relationships was also significant, as medieval people generally believed that divine intervention could play a role in bringing suitable partners together and guiding romantic relationships toward appropriate conclusions. Stories of couples who met in dreams, received divine signs about their romantic destinies, or experienced miraculous interventions that overcame obstacles to their relationships were common in medieval literature and were often believed to have actually occurred in real life. The medieval understanding of friendship and its relationship to romantic love was also complex and nuanced, with various forms of intense emotional connection between individuals being recognized and valued in ways that don't always map neatly onto modern categories of relationship types. The concept of romantic friendship, in particular, allowed for deep emotional bonds that might or might not include sexual or romantic elements, creating space for relationships that could develop and evolve over time in response to changing circumstances and opportunities. Medieval society's treatment of what we might call unconventional romantic relationships, including relationships between people of different social classes, different religious backgrounds, or different cultural traditions, was generally quite restrictive, though there were exceptions and variations depending on specific circumstances and local customs. The stories of couples who overcame significant social obstacles to be together were popular in medieval literature, but in reality, such relationships often faced severe consequences, including social ostracism, economic hardship, and even legal punishment. The gradual changes in medieval society over the course of the period, from roughly 500 to 1500 CE, also influenced how courtship and romantic relationships evolved. With increased urbanization, growing literacy rates, the development of more sophisticated legal systems, and changing economic structures, all contributing to new possibilities and constraints for romantic relationships. The late medieval period, in particular, saw the beginnings of what we might recognize as more modern approaches to courtship and marriage, though these changes occurred gradually and unevenly across different regions and social groups. The medieval period's legacy in terms of romantic relationships and courtship practices was complex and multifaceted, contributing both positive and negative elements to subsequent European and Western traditions surrounding love and marriage. The ideals of courtly love and chivalric romance continued to influence literature and culture for centuries, while the practical systems of arranged marriage and family-controlled courtship persisted in many forms well into the modern period. The documentation and preservation of medieval courtship practices in various forms of written and artistic records provide us with fascinating insights into how people in this distant historical period understood and experienced romantic relationships. Though we must always remember that most of our sources come from elite and literate segments of society and may not accurately represent the experiences of common people who made up the vast majority of the medieval population. The study of medieval courtship and dating practices also reveals important information about broader social economic, and cultural patterns that shaped medieval life, including the role of the family as a social institution, the relationship between individual desire and social obligation, the influence of religious doctrine on personal behavior, and the complex ways in which economic, political, and romantic considerations intersected in the lives of medieval people. When we consider what dating was like in medieval times, we must ultimately recognize that it was embedded within a completely different social, economic, and cultural context than our modern understanding of romantic relationships, and that the people of this period developed sophisticated and meaningful approaches to love, courtship, and marriage that served their needs and values, even if they seem strange or restrictive to us today. The medieval approach to romantic relationships was not simply a primitive version of modern dating, but rather a complex and coherent system that reflected the realities and priorities of medieval life, while still allowing for genuine human connection, emotional fulfillment, and romantic satisfaction within the constraints and opportunities that medieval society provided. The daily rhythms of medieval life created their own unique patterns for romantic interaction, with the agricultural cycle dominating the lives of most people and creating natural seasons for courtship and marriage. Spring planting and summer growing seasons were times of hope and renewal that often coincided with increased social activity and romantic interest, while harvest time brought communities together in shared labor that provided opportunities for young people to work alongside potential partners and observe their character, work ethic, and compatibility. Winter months, when agricultural work was reduced and families spent more time indoors, created more intimate settings for conversation and getting to know potential romantic partners, though always under the watchful eyes of parents and community members who took their supervisory roles seriously. The medieval manor system, which dominated rural life throughout much of the period, created specific contexts for romantic relationships that were shaped by the hierarchical nature of feudal society and the close proximity in which people of different social levels lived and worked. The lord of the manor and his family occupied the highest social position and had the most freedom in terms of marriage choices, though they were constrained by political and economic considerations that often took precedence over personal preference. The village priest, who was supposed to remain celibate according to church doctrine, though this rule was not always strictly enforced, occupied a unique position in the community that allowed him to observe and sometimes influence romantic relationships while remaining officially outside the marriage market himself. The emerging merchant class during the later medieval period created new possibilities for courtship and marriage that were somewhat different from traditional patterns among both nobles and peasants, as merchants often had more geographic mobility and economic independence that allowed for greater personal choice in romantic partners. A young merchant might meet potential partners in different cities and towns during his travels, and merchant families often arranged marriages that would strengthen trade relationships and create new business opportunities. But these arrangements still allowed for some consideration of personal compatibility and romantic attraction. particularly when the economic benefits of a match were clear and substantial. Medieval guilds and craft associations also played important roles in regulating courtship and marriage among their members, often establishing rules about when apprentices could marry, what qualifications were required for marriage, and how marriages should be conducted to maintain the reputation and economic interests of the guild. A young craftsman who wished to marry typically had to demonstrate that he had achieved a certain level of skill and economic stability, and guild masters often took an active interest in approving or disapproving marriages among their members, creating another layer of social supervision and regulation that influenced how romantic relationships developed. The role of godparents and other spiritual relationships in medieval society also influenced courtship practices, as these relationships created networks of mutual obligation and support that could either facilitate or complicate romantic relationships, depending on the specific circumstances involved. A young person's godparents might take an active role in finding suitable marriage partners or providing advice about romantic relationships, while spiritual relationships could also create impediments to marriage if they were deemed too close, according to church teachings about consanguinity and affinity. Medieval pilgrimage traditions created unique opportunities for romantic encounters that were somewhat outside the normal social structures and supervision systems that governed daily life, as people from different communities and social backgrounds came together in the shared experience of religious travel and devotion. The Canterbury Tales and other medieval literature describe romantic encounters and relationships that developed during pilgrimages, though these literary representations may not accurately reflect the reality of how such relationships actually unfolded and were received by families and communities when pilgrims returned home. The medieval understanding of time and its relationship to human life and romantic relationships was also quite different from modern concepts, with people generally expecting to live shorter lives and to marry and begin families at younger ages than would be considered appropriate today. This sense of limited time created urgency around courtship and marriage decisions that influenced how quickly relationships needed to develop and how much time could be spent in getting to know potential partners before commitments had to be made. Medieval concepts of honor and reputation were crucial factors in courtship and romantic relationships, with both men and women needing to maintain their good standing in the community in order to be considered suitable marriage partners. A woman's reputation for chastity and virtue was particularly important and could be damaged by even the appearance of impropriety, while a man's reputation for honesty, reliability, and skill in his chosen occupation was essential for his ability to attract a suitable wife and support a family. The medieval legal system's treatment of marriage and courtship varied significantly from region to region and evolved considerably over time, but generally emphasized the importance of consent, the exchange of vows, and the consummation of marriage as the essential elements that made a union legally valid. The development of more sophisticated legal frameworks around marriage created both protections and constraints for people seeking romantic relationships, establishing procedures for annulment and separation in cases where marriages failed, while also making it more difficult for people to escape unwanted marriages or enter into informal unions. Medieval medical understanding of human sexuality and reproduction influenced courtship practices in complex ways, with physicians and learned authorities providing advice about compatibility between potential partners, optimal timing for marriage and conception, and the maintenance of health and fertility within marriage. These medical teachings, which were often based on classical sources like Galen and Aristotle, rather than empirical observation, created expectations about romantic relationships and physical compatibility that influenced how people thought about their own experiences and desires. The role of storytelling and oral tradition in preserving and transmitting knowledge about courtship and romantic relationships was crucial in a largely illiterate society, with older community members passing down wisdom about marriage, relationships, and family life through stories, proverbs, and informal advice that helped young people understand what was expected of them and what strategies might be successful in finding suitable partners. Medieval concepts of beauty and physical attractiveness were influenced by both practical considerations and cultural ideals that were quite different from modern standards, with health, fertility, and social status being generally more important than purely aesthetic considerations. The ability to work hard, bear children, and contribute to household prosperity were often considered more attractive qualities than physical beauty alone, though appearance was still important, and people did take care with their grooming and dress when participating in social activities where they might meet potential romantic partners. The medieval household as an economic unit created specific dynamics for romantic relationships, with marriages often involving the merging of two families' resources, property, and social connections in ways that required careful negotiation and planning. Young people who were contemplating marriage had to consider not only their personal feelings, but also how their choice of partner would affect their family's economic and social position. And successful courtships often involved extensive discussions between families about property arrangements, inheritance rights, and other practical matters. Medieval attitudes toward emotional expression and the display of romantic feeling were generally more restrained than modern norms, with public demonstrations of affection being considered inappropriate and potentially scandalous, though private expressions of romantic attachment were recognized and valued within appropriate contexts. The literature of courtly love celebrated passionate emotional expression, but this was understood to be largely literary and aspirational, rather than a guide for actual behavior in real romantic relationships. The influence of classical literature and philosophy on medieval thinking about love and relationships extended beyond elite intellectual circles to influence popular culture and everyday attitudes through various forms of cultural transmission, including sermons, storytelling, and artistic representations that made classical ideas accessible to people who could not read Latin or Greek themselves. The works of Ovid, in particular, continued to influence medieval thinking about romantic strategy and the psychology of attraction, though these influences were filtered through Christian moral frameworks that emphasized the importance of marriage and the dangers of uncontrolled sexual desire. Medieval festivals and seasonal celebrations provided important opportunities for social interaction and romantic connection that were sanctioned by community tradition and religious observance, with events like harvest festivals, religious holidays, and Saints' Day celebrations, bringing together people from different families and communities in contexts where young people could meet and interact under community supervision. These festival contexts allowed for more relaxed social interaction than was typical in everyday life, including dancing, games, and other activities that could facilitate romantic interest while remaining within the bounds of appropriate behavior. The medieval understanding of marriage as a partnership that involved both spiritual and practical dimensions influenced how courtship unfolded and what expectations people had about romantic relationships, with successful marriages being those that achieved both mutual affection and practical cooperation in the management of household affairs and the raising of children. This dual understanding created complex dynamics in courtship, where emotional compatibility and practical suitability both needed to be assessed and balanced against each other. Medieval approaches to conflict resolution and the management of romantic disagreements were shaped by community-based systems of mediation and arbitration that emphasized restoration of harmony and the maintenance of social relationships over individual satisfaction or personal vindication. When romantic relationships encountered problems, or when courtship negotiations broke down, community elders, religious authorities, and family members would often intervene to help resolve conflicts and find solutions that preserved everyone's honor and social standing, while addressing the underlying issues that had caused the problem. The medieval period's gradual development of more individualistic approaches to religious experience and personal spirituality also influenced romantic relationships by creating space for more personal choice and emotional expression within the constraints of traditional social structures. The rise of devotional movements, mystical traditions, and personal piety created new vocabularies for discussing intense emotional experiences that could be applied to romantic relationships as well as religious devotion. Though the boundaries between spiritual and romantic love remained important and were carefully maintained by religious authorities. Medieval women's participation in economic activities outside the household created some opportunities for romantic relationships to develop in contexts that were not entirely controlled by families, particularly in urban areas where women might work as merchants, craftspeople, or in service occupations that brought them into contact with potential romantic partners from different social backgrounds. However, these opportunities were always balanced against concerns about reputation and the need to maintain appropriate behavior that would not compromise a woman's marriageability or social standing. The medieval legal tradition of requiring witnesses for valid marriages created important social dynamics around courtship and romantic relationships, as couples needed to ensure that their relationship development and marriage plans were conducted in ways that would be recognized and supported by their communities. This requirement for public recognition meant that romantic relationships could not remain entirely private affairs, but needed to unfold within social contexts that would provide the necessary witnesses and community support. Medieval attitudes toward age and its relationship to romantic suitability were complex and varied depending on social class and economic circumstances, with practical considerations often taking precedence over modern concepts about appropriate age differences between partners. Older widows or widowers who needed to remarry for economic or practical reasons might form relationships with much younger partners, while young people who inherited property or titles might be considered suitable marriage partners despite their youth because of their economic or social advantages. The medieval understanding of friendship and its relationship to romantic love created possibilities for deep emotional connections that could develop over time into romantic relationships, though the boundaries between different types of affection and attachment were carefully maintained and monitored by families and communities who were concerned about maintaining appropriate social relationships and avoiding scandal or impropriety. Medieval approaches to long-distance communication and the maintenance of romantic relationships across geographic barriers required considerable creativity and dedication, with couples relying on letters, gifts, and messages delivered by travelers to maintain their emotional connections over extended periods of separation. These long-distance relationships were often necessary due to economic, political, or family obligations that required one or both partners to travel or relocate, and their success depended on the ability of both individuals to maintain their commitment and affection despite limited contact and communication. The role of seasonal labor patterns and economic cycles in shaping medieval courtship practices created natural rhythms for romantic relationships that were tied to the agricultural calendar and the demands of different types of work throughout the year. Young people might meet during harvest season when communities came together for shared labor, develop their relationships during winter months when there was more time for conversation and social interaction, and finalize their marriage plans in spring when the promise of a new agricultural year made economic planning and household formation more practical and optimistic. Medieval concepts of loyalty and faithfulness in romantic relationships were influenced by feudal ideals of service and devotion that emphasized the importance of maintaining commitments and honoring obligations, even in the face of difficulty or temptation. These ideals created expectations about romantic behavior that valued constancy and dedication over passion or immediate gratification. And successful romantic relationships were often those that demonstrated the ability to maintain affection and commitment over long periods of time and through various challenges and obstacles. The medieval period's complex relationship with classical learning and pagan traditions created interesting tensions in attitudes toward romantic love and sexual desire, with Christian teachings about the spiritual dangers of physical attraction being balanced against classical celebrations of love and beauty that continued to influence literature, art, and popular culture throughout the medieval period. These tensions were often resolved through allegorical interpretations that allowed for the appreciation of romantic themes while maintaining appropriate moral and religious frameworks. The medieval institution of fosterage, where children from noble families were sent to be raised in other households, created unique dynamics for romantic relationships, as young people who had been fostered together often developed strong emotional bonds that could evolve into romantic attachments when they reached marriageable age. These fostering relationships created opportunities for young people to form connections based on genuine compatibility and mutual understanding, rather than purely political or economic considerations, though the families involved still maintained significant control over whether such relationships could develop into marriages. Medieval concepts of masculine and feminine virtue influenced courtship practices by creating specific expectations about how men and women should behave during romantic interactions, with men expected to demonstrate courage, generosity, and protective instincts, while women were expected to show modesty, discretion, and domestic competence. These gendered expectations shaped the ways in which romantic interest could be expressed and received, creating elaborate systems of symbolic communication and behavior that allowed couples to signal their interest and evaluate each other's suitability while maintaining appropriate decorum. The medieval practice of bundling, where young couples were allowed to sleep in the same bed while fully clothed and sometimes with a wooden board between them, represented one attempt to balance the need for couples to get to know each other intimately with the religious and social requirements for premarital chastity. This practice, which was more common in certain regions and social groups than others, allowed for physical proximity and intimate conversation, while theoretically preventing sexual contact, though its effectiveness in achieving this goal was undoubtedly variable. Medieval tournaments and martial competitions provided important contexts for romantic display and courtship, with knights and other warriors competing not only for prizes and honor, but also for the attention and favor of noble ladies who served as judges and spectators. These events created opportunities for dramatic romantic gestures and declarations that were sanctioned by social custom and chivalric tradition, allowing for more open expressions of romantic interest than were typically permitted in everyday social interactions. The role of servants and attendants in medieval romantic relationships extended beyond simple message carrying to include complex forms of assistance, surveillance, and manipulation that could either help or hinder developing relationships, depending on the motivations and loyalties of the individuals involved. A lady's maid might facilitate secret meetings between her mistress and a suitor, while a suspicious parent might use servants to spy on their child's romantic activities and report any inappropriate behavior. Medieval concepts of fortune and fate influenced romantic relationships by creating beliefs that marriages and romantic partnerships were predetermined by divine will or cosmic forces that humans could influence through prayer, good behavior, and appropriate ritual observances, but could not entirely control through their own choices and actions. These beliefs could provide comfort to people whose romantic lives did not unfold as they had hoped, while also creating pressure to accept arranged marriages or other relationships that might not align with personal preferences. The medieval understanding of dreams and their significance created another dimension to romantic relationships, with prophetic dreams about future spouses being considered important signs that needed to be carefully interpreted and acted upon. Medieval people often took their dreams about romantic partners very seriously, consulting religious authorities or other experts about the meaning of these visions, and sometimes making important relationship decisions based on dream experiences. Medieval attitudes toward remarriage after the death of a spouse were complex and varied depending on age, social status, and economic circumstances, with younger widows and widowers generally expected to remarry fairly quickly for practical and economic reasons, while older individuals might have more freedom to choose whether and whom to marry. The process of courtship for remarriage often moved more quickly than first marriages and involved different considerations, particularly regarding the treatment of children from previous marriages and the management of inherited property. The influence of astrological beliefs on medieval courtship practices was significant, with many people consulting astrologers or using astrological knowledge to determine compatibility between potential partners, optimal timing for marriages, and the likely success of romantic relationships. Medieval astrology included detailed theories about how the positions of planets and stars at the time of birth influenced personality, romantic compatibility, and marital happiness, and these beliefs shaped how people understood and approached their romantic lives. Medieval guilds and professional associations often served as informal matchmaking institutions, bringing together young people who shared similar social backgrounds, economic prospects, and professional interests in contexts where romantic relationships could develop naturally. The apprenticeship system, in particular, created opportunities for young men to meet the daughters of their masters or other guild members in settings where their character, work ethic, and potential for economic success could be evaluated over extended periods. The medieval practice of handfasting, where couples exchanged vows and lived together as married without formal church ceremonies, represented one form of romantic relationship that provided some of the benefits of marriage while allowing for more flexibility and personal choice than formal marriages typically permitted. Handfasting relationships could later be formalized through church ceremonies if circumstances permitted, or they could be dissolved more easily than formal marriages if the relationship proved unsuccessful. Medieval concepts of honor and shame created powerful motivations for maintaining proper behavior during courtship and romantic relationships, with individuals and families risking serious social consequences if they violated community standards regarding appropriate romantic conduct. The fear of bringing shame upon one's family or losing one's honor could be a powerful deterrent to inappropriate romantic behavior, while also creating pressure to fulfill social expectations regarding marriage and family formation. The medieval institution of sanctuary, where churches and other religious institutions provided protection for people fleeing various forms of persecution or violence, sometimes created opportunities for star-crossed lovers to escape family opposition or other obstacles to their relationships, though such dramatic solutions were rarely successful in the long term and often resulted in permanent exile from home communities. Medieval understanding of the relationship between physical health and romantic attraction led to various practices aimed at maintaining or improving one's appeal to potential partners, including the use of herbs and other substances believed to enhance beauty or fertility, special diets and exercise regimens, and careful attention to personal hygiene and grooming. These practices reflected both practical knowledge about health and appearance and various folk beliefs about magic and supernatural influences on romantic relationships. The medieval legal concept of rape and its relationship to marriage created complex and problematic dynamics around consent and choice in romantic relationships, with some legal traditions holding that rape could be remedied by marriage between the perpetrator and victim, effectively removing women's agency in romantic decisions and creating opportunities for forced marriages disguised as romantic relationships. Medieval attitudes toward interfaith romantic relationships were generally hostile and restrictive, with marriages between Christians and non-Christians being prohibited by church law and often illegal under secular law as well. However, the reality of religious diversity in medieval Europe, particularly in border regions and commercial centers, meant that such relationships did occur and sometimes resulted in conversion, exile, or other dramatic life changes for the individuals involved. The medieval practice of child engagement, where very young children were promised in marriage to seal political or economic alliances between families, created complex situations where romantic relationships had to develop within predetermined frameworks that left little room for personal choice or natural attraction. Many of these early engagements were later dissolved or renegotiated as circumstances changed, but they demonstrate the extent to which romantic relationships were subordinated to larger social and economic considerations. Medieval concepts of romantic jealousy and its management influenced courtship practices by creating expectations about appropriate responses to romantic competition and rival suitors, with elaborate codes of conduct governing how men should respond to challenges to their romantic interests and how women should handle the attentions of multiple suitors. These conventions were designed to minimize conflict and violence, while still allowing for competitive courtship and romantic choice. The medieval tradition of love tokens and romantic gifts created symbolic languages of courtship that allowed couples to communicate their feelings and intentions through carefully chosen objects that carried specific meanings understood by their social communities. Rings, flowers, books, and other items served as messengers of romantic intent and commitment, allowing for complex negotiations of romantic relationships through material exchanges that could be interpreted by families and communities, as well as the individuals directly involved. Medieval seasonal migration patterns, including transhumance practices where communities moved with their livestock between different grazing areas, created opportunities for romantic relationships to develop between people from different regions and communities who might not otherwise have had opportunities to meet. These seasonal encounters could lead to long-distance courtships and marriages that connected different communities and regions through romantic relationships. The medieval understanding of widowhood and its impact on romantic opportunities was shaped by both practical considerations about economic security and social beliefs about appropriate behavior for people who had lost their spouses, with younger widows often facing pressure to remarry quickly, while older widows might gain unprecedented freedom to make their own romantic choices without family interference. Medieval concepts of romantic constancy and faithfulness were tested by the realities of separation, travel, and uncertain communication that characterized much of medieval life, with couples often having to maintain their romantic commitments over long periods of uncertainty about each other's welfare, intentions, and continued affection. The ability to maintain romantic relationships despite these challenges was considered a sign of true love and moral virtue. The medieval institution of godparenthood created spiritual relationships that could both facilitate and complicate romantic relationships, as godparents were expected to take active interests in their godchildren's welfare and moral development, including their romantic relationships and marriage choices, while also being prohibited from marrying anyone to whom they were related through godparenthood. Medieval attitudes toward physical beauty and its role in romantic attraction were influenced by both aesthetic preferences and practical considerations about health, fertility, and social status, with different regions and time periods emphasizing different physical characteristics as particularly attractive or desirable in potential romantic partners. Medieval concepts of romantic redemption and the transformative power of love influenced courtship practices by creating beliefs that appropriate romantic relationships could help individuals overcome personal flaws, achieve moral improvement, and fulfill their social and spiritual potential in ways that remaining single individuals could not accomplish. The medieval practice of trial marriage, where couples lived together for a specified period before making permanent commitments, provided one mechanism for allowing romantic relationships to develop and be tested before final decisions about marriage were made. Though this practice was more accepted in some regions and communities than in others, and was often disapproved of by religious authorities. Medieval understanding of the relationship between romantic love and divine love created complex theological and philosophical frameworks that influenced how people understood their romantic experiences and integrated them with their religious beliefs and spiritual development, with some traditions viewing earthly romantic love as a distraction from spiritual devotion, while others saw it as a pathway to understanding divine love and cosmic harmony. The medieval monastery and convent systems created alternative paths for individuals who chose religious life over marriage. But these institutions also sometimes became sites of complex romantic relationships that challenged official teachings about celibacy and spiritual devotion, with some religious communities developing their own internal cultures around emotional attachments and spiritual friendships that could blur the boundaries between religious and romantic love. Medieval concepts of romantic suffering and the ennobling effects of unfulfilled desire influenced courtship practices by creating expectations that true love should involve some degree of struggle, sacrifice, and emotional pain that would demonstrate the sincerity and depth of romantic commitment, while also providing opportunities for moral and spiritual growth through the experience of longing and devotion. The medieval understanding of marriage as a social contract that involved entire communities rather than just individual couples created complex dynamics around courtship and romantic relationships, with community members feeling entitled to express opinions about potential matches, and sometimes intervening directly to prevent or encourage particular relationships based on their assessment of what would be best for all parties involved. Medieval practices around the blessing and sanctification of romantic relationships involved elaborate rituals and ceremonies that served to integrate individual couples into the broader religious and social frameworks of their communities, with priests, family members, and community leaders all playing roles in legitimizing and supporting new romantic partnerships through various forms of ritual observance and public recognition. The medieval tradition of romantic pilgrimage, where couples or individuals seeking romantic fulfillment would travel to particular shrines or holy sites associated with love and marriage, created opportunities for romantic relationships to develop in contexts that were both spiritually meaningful and somewhat removed from the normal social constraints and family supervision that governed everyday romantic interactions. Medieval concepts of romantic destiny and the belief that certain individuals were intended for each other by divine will influence courtship practices by creating expectations that true romantic partnerships would be characterized by a sense of inevitability and cosmic rightness that would overcome obstacles and challenges that might prevent other relationships from succeeding. The medieval understanding of the relationship between physical appearance and moral character led to beliefs that beautiful people were more likely to be virtuous, and that romantic attraction was partly based on the recognition of spiritual as well as physical beauty, creating complex dynamics around courtship where appearance, character, and spiritual development were all considered interconnected aspects of romantic suitability. Medieval guild systems often included provisions for supporting the romantic relationships and marriages of their members, including financial assistance for dowries and wedding celebrations, help with finding suitable partners, and mediation services for couples who encountered difficulties in their relationships, demonstrating the extent to which professional and economic communities took responsibility for the personal welfare of their members. The medieval practice of seasonal courtship, where romantic activities were concentrated during certain times of year that were considered more auspicious for love and marriage, created natural rhythms for romantic relationships that were synchronized with agricultural cycles, religious observances, and social customs that brought communities together for shared celebrations and activities. Medieval concepts of romantic honor and the importance of maintaining one's reputation in romantic matters influenced courtship practices by creating elaborate codes of conduct that governed how individuals should behave toward potential partners, current romantic interests, and former lovers, with violations of these codes resulting in social consequences that could affect one's ability to form future romantic relationships. The medieval institution of courtly entertainment, including music, poetry, dancing, and games, provided structured contexts for romantic interaction that allowed young people to demonstrate their cultural accomplishments and social skills, while engaging in activities that could facilitate romantic interest and compatibility assessment within appropriate social boundaries. Medieval attitudes toward romantic competition and rivalry were shaped by both chivalric ideals that emphasized honor and courtesy in dealing with romantic rivals and practical considerations about maintaining social harmony and preventing conflicts that could disrupt community peace and stability. The medieval understanding of romantic compatibility extended beyond personal attraction to include considerations about astrological compatibility, family backgrounds, economic circumstances, and spiritual development, creating complex systems for evaluating potential romantic partnerships that took into account multiple factors beyond immediate emotional or physical attraction. Medieval practices around romantic communication, including the use of symbolic gifts, coded messages, and intermediaries, created elaborate systems for expressing and interpreting romantic interest that allowed couples to negotiate their relationships while maintaining appropriate social decorum and avoiding direct confrontation with family or community disapproval. The medieval tradition of romantic storytelling and the preservation of love stories through oral and written literature created cultural repositories of knowledge about romantic relationships that provided models, warnings, and inspiration for people navigating their own romantic lives, with these stories serving both entertainment and educational functions in communities where formal education about relationships was limited. Medieval concepts of romantic sacrifice and the willingness to give up personal desires for the welfare of loved ones influenced courtship practices by creating expectations that true love should be demonstrated through acts of selflessness and devotion that might involve significant personal costs, but would ultimately strengthen romantic bonds and demonstrate moral virtue. The medieval understanding of the relationship between romantic love and social order created tensions between individual romantic desires and community stability that were managed through various institutional mechanisms, including family oversight, religious guidance, legal regulations, and social customs that sought to channel romantic energy in directions that would support rather than threaten existing social structures. Medieval practices around romantic reconciliation and the resolution of conflicts between lovers involved community-based mediation systems that emphasized restoration of harmony and the preservation of relationships over punishment or individual vindication, reflecting beliefs that romantic relationships were too important to community welfare to be abandoned lightly over temporary disagreements or misunderstandings. The medieval institution of romantic patronage, where wealthy individuals would sponsor the romantic relationships and marriages of their dependents, created opportunities for romantic relationships to develop between people who might not otherwise have been able to afford marriage, while also creating new forms of social obligation and dependence that could complicate romantic relationships. Medieval concepts of romantic transformation and the belief that love could fundamentally change individuals for better influenced courtship practices by creating expectations that romantic relationships should inspire moral improvement, spiritual development, and social advancement that would benefit not only the individuals involved, but also their families and communities. The medieval understanding of romantic timing and the importance of choosing appropriate moments for romantic expressions and commitments was influenced by astrological beliefs, religious calendars, agricultural cycles, and social customs that created complex schedules for romantic activities that couples needed to navigate in order to ensure the success and social acceptance of their relationships. Medieval attitudes toward romantic privacy and the balance between individual romantic desires and community oversight created ongoing tensions that were managed through various compromises and accommodations that allowed couples some degree of personal autonomy, while maintaining the social supervision and support that medieval communities considered necessary for successful romantic relationships. The medieval practice of romantic apprenticeship, where young people learned about courtship and romantic relationships through observation of and participation in the romantic activities of older community members, created informal educational systems that transmitted knowledge about romantic behavior, relationship management, and marriage preparation across generations. Medieval concepts of romantic virtue and the moral qualities that made individuals suitable for romantic relationships emphasized characteristics like loyalty, honesty, generosity, and piety that were considered essential for successful marriages and family life, creating standards for romantic behavior that were integrated with broader social and religious expectations about proper conduct. The medieval understanding of romantic cycles and the natural rhythms of attraction, courtship, commitment, and marriage created expectations about how romantic relationships should develop over time, with different phases of romantic involvement requiring different types of behavior, commitment levels, and social recognition. Medieval practices around romantic celebration and the commemoration of important moments in romantic relationships involved elaborate ceremonies, gift exchanges, and community festivities that served to mark significant transitions in romantic status, while also reinforcing social bonds and cultural values related to love, marriage, and family life. The medieval tradition of romantic mentorship, where experienced individuals provided guidance and support to young people navigating romantic relationships, created networks of advice and assistance that helped couples overcome obstacles and challenges, while also ensuring that romantic relationships developed within appropriate social and moral frameworks. Medieval concepts of romantic legacy and the ways in which romantic relationships contributed to family continuity and social stability influenced courtship practices by creating expectations that romantic partnerships should produce children, build wealth, strengthen social connections, and contribute to the long-term welfare of extended families and communities. The medieval understanding of romantic healing and the therapeutic effects of loving relationships was influenced by both medical theories and spiritual beliefs about the connection between emotional well-being and physical health, creating expectations that successful romantic relationships would contribute to overall health and happiness, while unsuccessful relationships might lead to illness and spiritual distress. Medieval practices around romantic protection and the safeguarding of romantic relationships from various threats, including family opposition, economic hardship, social disapproval, and supernatural dangers, involved elaborate systems of support and defense that demonstrated the high value placed on successful romantic partnerships and the recognition that such relationships needed community assistance to survive and thrive. The medieval institution of romantic service, where individuals demonstrated their devotion through acts of service and dedication to their beloved, created opportunities for romantic relationships to develop through practical assistance and mutual support, while also providing mechanisms for evaluating romantic suitability through observation of behavior over extended periods. Medieval concepts of romantic wisdom and the knowledge required for successful romantic relationships emphasized the importance of understanding human nature, social dynamics, family politics, and spiritual principles that would enable individuals to navigate the complex world of medieval courtship and marriage successfully. The medieval understanding of romantic justice and the fair treatment of all parties involved in romantic relationships created expectations about appropriate behavior toward romantic partners, family members, rivals, and community members that were designed to maintain social harmony while allowing for individual romantic fulfillment within appropriate bounds. Medieval practices around romantic remembrance and the preservation of romantic relationships through memory, storytelling, and commemoration reflected beliefs about the lasting significance of romantic love and its continued importance even after death or separation, creating cultural traditions that honored romantic devotion and provided comfort to those who had lost their beloved partners. The medieval tradition of romantic innovation and the gradual development of new forms of romantic expression, courtship practices, and marriage customs demonstrated the dynamic nature of medieval romantic culture and its ability to adapt and evolve in response to changing social, economic, and cultural circumstances, while maintaining core values and principles about love, commitment, and family life. Medieval concepts of romantic completion and the belief that romantic partnerships could fulfill human beings in ways that remained impossible through individual effort alone influenced courtship practices. By creating expectations that successful romantic relationships would provide emotional, spiritual, physical, and social satisfaction that would enable individuals to achieve their full potential as human beings within the context of medieval society. The medieval understanding of romantic education and the learning processes involved in developing successful romantic relationships emphasized the importance of observation, practice, and guidance from experienced individuals who could provide wisdom about navigating the complex social, emotional, and practical challenges that romantic partnerships involved, creating informal but sophisticated systems of knowledge transmission about love, courtship, and marriage. Medieval attitudes toward romantic experimentation and the exploration of different types of relationships were generally constrained by social and religious norms that discouraged behavior that might threaten established patterns of family formation and social organization. Though some flexibility existed within these constraints for individuals to learn about their own romantic preferences and compatibility with different types of partners. The medieval institution of romantic arbitration and the resolution of disputes arising from courtship and romantic relationships involved community leaders, family elders, and religious authorities who served as mediators and judges in cases where romantic conflicts threatened to disrupt social harmony or violate established customs and moral standards. Medieval concepts of romantic evolution and the ways in which romantic relationships changed and developed over time recognized that successful partnerships required ongoing attention, adjustment, and renewal that would allow couples to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their fundamental commitment and affection for each other. The medieval understanding of romantic geography and the ways in which physical location influenced romantic opportunities and challenges created awareness that different regions, climates, and social environments offer different possibilities for romantic relationships, with some areas being more conducive to certain types of courtship and marriage patterns than others. Medieval practices around romantic documentation and the recording of important events and agreements related to romantic relationships involved various forms of written and oral record keeping that served to preserve important information about family histories, property arrangements, and social commitments that would affect future generations. The medieval tradition of romantic symbolism and the use of various objects, colors, flowers, and other elements to communicate romantic meanings created rich vocabularies of visual and material communication that allowed couples to express complex emotions and intentions through carefully chosen symbolic representations. Medieval concepts of romantic reciprocity and the importance of mutual giving and receiving in successful romantic relationships emphasized the need for balanced exchanges of affection, support, service, and commitment that would create stable and satisfying partnerships based on fairness and mutual benefit rather than exploitation or one-sided devotion. The medieval understanding of romantic resilience and the ability of romantic relationships to survive and recover from various challenges and setbacks recognized that successful partnerships required strength, flexibility, and dedication that would enable couples to overcome obstacles and rebuild their connections when faced with difficulties. Medieval practices around romantic celebration and the marking of important milestones in romantic relationships involved elaborate ceremonies, festivals, and commemorative activities that served to strengthen romantic bonds while also reinforcing social connections and cultural values related to love, commitment, and family life. The medieval institution of romantic inheritance and the ways in which romantic relationships and marriage patterns were influenced by property transfers, inheritance rights, and economic considerations created complex dynamics where individual romantic preferences had to be balanced against family economic strategies and long-term financial planning. Medieval concepts of romantic authenticity and the importance of genuine feeling and sincere commitment in romantic relationships created tensions between social expectations about appropriate romantic behavior and individual desires for authentic emotional expression and personal fulfillment. The medieval understanding of romantic community and the ways in which individual romantic relationships were embedded within larger networks of family, friendship, and social connection emphasized the interconnected nature of personal relationships and the importance of maintaining harmony between romantic partnerships and broader social obligations. Medieval practices around romantic preparation and the education and training that young people receive to prepare them for successful romantic relationships and marriages involved formal and informal instruction in social skills, domestic arts, moral principles, and practical knowledge that would enable them to fulfill their roles as spouses and parents. The medieval tradition of romantic literature and the preservation of stories, poems, and other artistic works that explored themes of love, courtship, and marriage created cultural resources that provided inspiration, guidance, and entertainment for people navigating their own romantic lives, while also preserving knowledge about romantic ideals and practices for future generations. Medieval concepts of romantic responsibility and the obligations that individuals had toward their romantic partners, families, and communities emphasized the serious nature of romantic commitments and the importance of fulfilling one's duties and responsibilities in romantic relationships, even when personal desires might conflict with social expectations. The medieval understanding of romantic mystery and the recognition that certain aspects of romantic attraction, compatibility, and relationship dynamics could not be fully explained or predicted through rational analysis created space for acknowledging the mysterious and unpredictable elements of human emotional life, while still maintaining practical approaches to courtship and marriage. medieval practices around romantic negotiation, and the complex discussions and agreements that were required to arrange marriages and establish romantic partnerships involved sophisticated diplomatic skills and careful attention to the interests and concerns of all parties involved in romantic relationships. The medieval institution of romantic sanctuary and the provision of protection and support for individuals whose romantic relationships faced various forms of opposition or persecution demonstrated community recognition that romantic relationships were important enough to deserve protection and assistance when they encountered serious obstacles. Medieval concepts of romantic integration and the ways in which successful romantic relationships needed to be woven into the broader fabric of social, economic, and spiritual life emphasized the importance of ensuring that romantic partnerships contributed to rather than conflicted with other important aspects of medieval existence. The medieval understanding of romantic seasons and the natural cycles that influenced when different types of romantic activities were most appropriate or successful created sophisticated awareness of timing and rhythm in romantic relationships that took into account both practical considerations and symbolic meanings associated with different times of year. Medieval practices around romantic counseling and the provision of advice and guidance to individuals and couples facing romantic challenges involved networks of family members, friends, community leaders, and religious authorities who offered support and wisdom based on their own experiences and cultural knowledge about successful relationship management. The medieval tradition of romantic craft and the skilled development of abilities and techniques that would make individuals more successful in romantic relationships emphasized the importance of learning and practice in developing the social, emotional, and practical competencies that successful romantic partnerships required. Medieval concepts of romantic legacy and the long-term impact that romantic relationships had on families, communities, and future generations created awareness that individual romantic choices had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate satisfaction of personal desires and affected the welfare of many other people over extended periods of time. The medieval understanding of romantic balance and the need to maintain appropriate proportions between romantic relationships and other important aspects of life, including work, family obligations, religious devotion, and community service, created frameworks for evaluating whether romantic relationships were healthy and sustainable, or were becoming excessive and potentially problematic. Medieval practices around romantic restoration and the repair and renewal of romantic relationships that had been damaged by conflict, betrayal, separation, or other challenges involved sophisticated approaches to forgiveness, reconciliation, and relationship rebuilding that recognized both the value of romantic partnerships and the reality that they required ongoing maintenance and attention. The medieval institution of romantic mentorship and the guidance provided by experienced individuals to younger people learning about romantic relationships created systems of knowledge transmission that helped ensure that each generation would have access to accumulated wisdom about successful courtship and marriage practices. Medieval concepts of romantic transcendence and the belief that romantic love could elevate individuals beyond their ordinary limitations and enable them to achieve greater moral, spiritual, and social development influenced courtship practices by creating expectations that romantic relationships should inspire personal growth and improvement. The medieval understanding of romantic diversity and the recognition that different individuals had different romantic needs, preferences, and capabilities created some flexibility within social systems that were generally quite rigid and restrictive, allowing for some variation in courtship and marriage patterns based on individual circumstances and characteristics. Medieval practices around romantic commemoration and the preservation of memories and celebrations related to important moments in romantic relationships created traditions that helped couples maintain their emotional connections over time, while also providing models and inspiration for other couples in their communities. The medieval tradition of romantic wisdom literature and the development of written works that provided advice and instruction about romantic relationships created repositories of knowledge that could be consulted by individuals seeking guidance about courtship, marriage, and relationship management. Medieval concepts of romantic calling and the belief that some individuals were particularly suited for romantic relationships, while others might be called to different types of life, including religious celibacy or other forms of service, created frameworks for understanding individual differences in romantic interest and capability. The medieval understanding of romantic fulfillment and the ways in which successful romantic relationships could provide satisfaction and meaning that contributed to overall life satisfaction and spiritual development emphasized the positive potential of romantic love, while also acknowledging its limitations and the importance of maintaining appropriate perspectives about its role in human life. In contemplating what dating was like in medieval times, we must remember that the very concept of dating as a casual exploration of romantic compatibility through informal social interaction simply did not exist in medieval society, where romantic relationships were typically formal processes involving families, communities, and established social institutions that regulated and supervised every aspect of courtship and marriage. The medieval approach to romantic relationships was characterized by formality, community involvement, practical considerations, and integration with broader social, economic, and religious frameworks that shaped every aspect of life during this fascinating and complex period of human history, creating patterns of romantic behavior that were very different from our modern experiences, but were nonetheless meaningful and fulfilling for the people who lived within these systems and found ways to express their deepest human needs for love, companionship, and intimate connection within the constraints and opportunities that medieval society provided.